My name is Dan Scucciarino. I'm the Customer Learning and Development Consultant here at RightCapital, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you for today's webinar on RightRisk, which is RightCapital's new integrated risk assessment tool. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar, this is a new feature that was released on Tuesday of this past week. So you may have woken up to a pleasant surprise on Tuesday morning. And this was really a very large update. It introduced a lot of new tools and features, all revolving around risk tolerance, assessment, and analysis. So that being said, we have quite a lot of content to cover here today. So without further ado, let's dive into our agenda. This presentation is really going to serve as a comprehensive introduction to risk in RightCapital. So we're going to look at the risk module in the advisor portal. We're going to explore the client-specific risk analysis within a client plan. And we're going to touch on every tool and every feature along the way. So we'll look at creating and assigning risk tolerance questionnaires. We'll look at assigning clients a household risk score and analyzing the risk of a client's current portfolio. And of course, we'll touch on how you can implement some or all of these tools into your unique practice. All of these tools were designed to be flexible so that you can customize them to fit your specific needs and the needs of your clients. Perfect. I am going to take a quick pause here to pivot over to my RightCapital account. So bear with me just a moment and we can get started. All right, so first things first here, I want to begin by establishing some important ground rules and explaining some key concepts and key terms that are going to be popping up in several of the different areas we're going to look at today. So I am going to start us off in the client-specific risk analysis for this, which can be found in the investment section of each client plan. So I'm going to launch into my household here for Barry and Iris. Going to navigate to the investment module and then into the risk tab. So here we are in the summary tab of the client-specific risk analysis for Barry and Iris. And the first thing you might notice here is the summary chart, which for all intents and purposes is a visualization of risk score in RightCapital. So the first and most important term to know and understand when it comes to RightRisk is this idea of a risk score. So RightCapital measures risk on a 1 to 100 scale, with 1 being the least amount of risk and 100 being the most amount of risk. And that's going to hold true across the different risk features and tools. And there are a couple of different types of risk scores that we're going to encounter today. So I want to take a quick moment and explain what each of those are. There are really 3 main types of risk scores that we'll come across. The first of these being the household risk score, which is for this client plan, this number 70 here on the spectrum. And this household risk score represents this client or client household's tolerance for risk. And this is a number that is manually assigned by you as the advisor within the client plan here. Specifically, that's done in the score and assessments tab. So I've manually assigned Barry and Iris a household risk score of 70, as we can see here. So that's really the first type of risk score to be aware of here. Our second main type of risk score is the current portfolio risk score. So in this plan, that's this 81 here. And unlike the household risk score, this is not a number that we assign. This is a number that RightCapital is calculating based on all of the accounts that are entered or linked in the profile net worth section of the plan. So RightCapital is going to take a look at all of this client's accounts that make up their current investment allocation. And depending on how volatile that portfolio is, it's going to assign that client's current portfolio a risk score on this 1 to 100 scale. So that's the current portfolio risk score. And lastly, if you're someone who's going to utilize risk assessment questionnaires, then the third type of risk score to be aware of is going to be the risk assessment score, which, as the name suggests, is the score that a client receives on a given risk assessment. So those are really the 3 main types of risk scores to be aware of. They all revolve around this same 1 to 100 scale. And now that we've set that foundation and looked at some of those key terms, We are going to pivot back into the risk module in the advisor portal and start looking over all the different tools that you have at your disposal with RightRisk. So I'm going to click back into the advisor portal here and then navigate to the risk module in the top menu bar of my advisor portal. So this is the advisor portal risk module. No matter how your personal RightCapital account is set up, a risk will always be plainly visible here in the top menu bar. And the advisor portal risk module is really going to play three main roles. This is going to be where you can find an overview or a summary of all of the key risk information across all of your client households and model portfolios. This is going to be where you can create and edit risk assessment questionnaires. And it's also where you can choose to enable and customize risk tolerance categories. So there's a lot that we can do here, and we are going to go through each of these tabs in order today, starting with the summary here. So the summary tab is broken up into two different pages, those being household and portfolio. And as the name suggests, the household page here is where we can see that summary of the key risk information for each and every client household. So here we have my list of clients, and from left to right, we see client name and client group, followed by each client's equity fixed income split. So this is based on the current allocation of that client's investment portfolio. We have that current portfolio risk score that we talked about, so the risk of that client's current portfolio. We have the date in which that client last completed an assessment. So for my client Barry here, that's today, 5/10. Then we have the risk score. So this is the household risk score, that manually assigned score that we looked at, which for Barry was, if you'll remember, 70. And then lastly, we have the difference here between that client's current portfolio risk score and the household risk score that we've assigned to them. So, this page makes it very easy to identify any large discrepancies between a client's tolerance for risk that we've assigned them and the actual risk of their investments. One additional note before we move on from this page, you may have noticed there's a little asterisk next to the current portfolio risk and the equity fixed income split. You can hover your mouse over this to see when this was last updated. Both of these figures will update automatically once per business day. So, if you do have accounts that are linked in a client plan and those are updating in real time, both of these numbers will also update automatically in the risk summary here. Perfect. The other page within the summary here is the portfolio page. And this is where we can find risk information for all of the model portfolios in this RightCapital account. So this is going to include the RightCapital pre-built models, so preservation through most aggressive. It's also going to include custom models that are built out manually in the models tab of your advisor portal. So I have a couple custom models that are being pulled in here as well. And it's also going to include imported models. So if you have models that have been imported via a third-party integration like nitrogen, those are also going to appear on this list. And importantly, we can find the risk scores for each of these different model portfolios. And these are calculated in the exact same way as the current portfolio risk score for a client. So it's going to look to the standard deviation or the volatility of that portfolio based on the allocation and the asset class breakdown. So in addition to being able to see that risk score and the standard deviation here, we're also going to see the annual return and the potential downside and upside percentages, which are all based on your advisor-specific return assumptions. So if you were curious how we're getting these numbers here for return, downside, and upside, it is based on your return assumptions. And as a reminder, you can always double check and adjust your return assumptions within the More menu in your advisor portal and then in the Assumptions tab. So you can double check those numbers there. Perfect. You may have also noticed this column on the far right here for risk categories. That's a little bit of a sneak peek at one of the things we're going to look at in just a few minutes here. So file that one away for now, and we'll circle back once we get to the categories tab here. But first, before we get to categories, we have our questionnaires tab. And in particular, I'm really excited to be able to show off this particular aspect of our risk tool. This is where we can add, edit, and publish risk assessment questionnaires. So if you're someone who already utilizes risk tolerance questionnaires with your clients and in your practice, this is a really great opportunity to integrate that process directly into RightCapital. First things first, when you visit this page for the very first time, you'll notice that there is a default risk assessment that is already built into each and every RightCapital account. So just a little bit of context here. This is the 13-item risk tolerance scale developed by Dr. John Grable and Dr. Ruth Litton. It's usually just called the Grable and Litton questionnaire. So this is a pretty well-established and widely used questionnaire in the industry that's been around for quite some time. And this is going to be built in for you as a starting point. So feel free to utilize this as is with your clients if you'd like. You can also make edits to this default questionnaire by clicking into these questions, as long as you haven't already started using this. So you can fully customize this as well to better suit your own preferences. Of course, in addition to the default assessments, we can also create our own custom risk assessments using this tool. So this is where the real fun begins. And I'm going to walk us through the process of creating a simple questionnaire from scratch today, just to demonstrate how this process works. So to create a new risk assessment, you can click the Add Questionnaire button here in the upper right, and that's going to add a new questionnaire for us as a draft. So whenever you add a new questionnaire, it'll always start off as a blank slate, and it's always going to start as a draft. So once we actually finish completing this questionnaire, we can publish this so that we can use it with our clients, but it'll always start in the draft stage. So the first thing we can do here is rename our questionnaire. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call this a webinar questionnaire for today. There is also an option to add an introduction here. This is an optional field, but if you'd like to add a message here that your client will see, maybe something along the lines of, please complete my questionnaire. Now you can add a little message here as an introduction for that questionnaire as well. And then once you've got the title and the introduction, this is where we can begin adding questions to this questionnaire. So if we scroll down to the bottom here and then click the Add Question button on the far right, it's going to open up this drawer for us on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is where we can begin adding the first question for our questionnaire. So I do have some questions locked and loaded here on the right-hand side of my other screen, so bear with me just a quick second. I did grab a couple questions from some actual risk assessment questionnaires out there just for a realistic example here for today. So here's question one. I just copied and pasted that into the questions field at the top of this drawer. And then, once the question is typed in, we can click Add Response to begin adding our answers for that question. So these are the answers that the client is going to have to choose from. And I'm going to copy and paste in my first response here. And for each description, or for each response rather, you'll add a description, and then you'll assign each response a corresponding risk value. So just like our risk score, 1 to 100 scale, lower numbers equate to a lower tolerance for risk, and higher numbers equate to a higher tolerance for risk. So each question is going to have a corresponding risk value. Just going to keep adding my responses here. And you may notice that I'm not using a 1 to 100 scale here. Regardless of the specific scale that you use for each question, RightCapital is always going to recalculate the score at the end of the day to fit that 1 to 100 scale. So if you do want to build out your questionnaires on a 1 through 10 scale, or 1 through 20, whatever scale you'd like to use, that's totally okay. It'll recalculate those scores at the end of the day to fit that 1 to 100 scale. So here we have our first question. All of our responses have been entered and assigned a corresponding risk value. And then we can click OK to lock in that question. Perfect. So I'm going to add one more question here just to walk through that process one more time. So I'm going to copy and paste question 2 into this field here. Do make sure to click the blue check mark next to these text boxes to save your changes whenever you're typing these questions out. And then for the responses, So copying and pasting these responses can certainly be a quicker way to enter these questionnaires if you already have a questionnaire that you utilize in your practice. You don't have to type everything out from scratch. You can certainly copy and paste those questions and answers in as I'm doing here. And I do want to mention that, as you're adding these responses, if you want to mix things up a little bit and, maybe not have low risk be the first answer and high risk be the last answer every time, you can drag and drop these responses to rearrange the order that they'll appear for the client. So maybe we want to mix it up for question 2 and have the high risk answer be the first response and low risk be the final response. You can drag and drop these around. Perfect. So adding questions is, for the most part, pretty straightforward, and you can continue to rinse and repeat that process until you've entered all of the questions for your questionnaire and all of the responses and risk values for each individual question. And once you have all of the questions entered, the last step of this process is to click the Publish button in the lower right corner. So as I mentioned, each questionnaire is going to start as a draft, and clicking the Publish button is what will make that questionnaire available to be used within each of your client plans. So now that I've published this questionnaire that we just created, this is going to be an option within the client-specific risk analysis in each client plan, which is where we actually assign that questionnaire to a particular client to have them fill that out. And that's something we're going to look at very shortly here once we finish going over the Advisor Portal risk module. Perfect. That being said, there is one more tab in the risk module here in the Advisor Portal, and that is going to be the Categories tab. So risk categories in RightCapital are an entirely optional feature, meaning that you can toggle these, on and off at any time. But by turning these on, you have the ability to create your own risk tolerance categories. This is completely customizable for each and every advisor. And the way that I like to describe this is that it gives you the opportunity to align RightCapital's 1 to 100 risk scale with your unique perspective on risk and really make the scoring system your own. So if you are someone who prefers to think of risk tolerance in terms of more broad categories rather than a specific number, this tool gives you the power to do that and to incorporate that into the analysis and into the visuals. So by default, you will find 3 categories here: a low tolerance category from a risk score of 1 to a risk score of 40, medium tolerance from 41 to 70, and then high tolerance from 71 to 100. So with this setup, if a portfolio or a household has a risk score of between 1 and 40, they'll be classified as low risk, and so on and so forth here. And we can actually see this visually if we pop back over into the Summary tab here and take a look at this Portfolios page. And we can see that because we have our categories turned on, we're able to see which category each portfolio falls into based on the risk score for that's being calculated for each one of these portfolios. Of course, you are by no means locked into using these default categories. As I said, this is fully customizable. So let's add a couple of new categories here. You can add a new category by hovering your mouse over any point of this sort of risk spectrum here and just clicking your mouse there. It's going to add a new band. We call these bands to the graph. And it's also going to add a new category down at the bottom here. So maybe for this example, we want to add 2 additional categories on the low end and the high end. We can rename each category whatever we'd like here. So maybe we'll do very low tolerance from 1 to 20, then we'll do just low tolerance from 21 to 40, and then we have an additional, maybe an additional category at the top end for very high tolerance. Perfect. So that's a pretty simple example here, but you have the ability to add up to 10 categories, so you can very easily customize this to suit your own views on risk. Perfect. The last 2 things that I want to mention here is that if you've added one too many categories and you need to delete one, you can always hover your mouse over a category at the bottom here and click this X icon, and that's going to delete that category. And as I mentioned before, risk categories are an entirely optional feature. So if you don't want to use these in your analysis, you can simply toggle these off. And by doing that, anywhere that you would find a risk category listed before, such as that summary portfolios tab, those categories are simply going to be hidden from view. Perfect. I am going to turn categories back on for now, just because there is an additional chart that is tied to these that I want to be able to show you within the client plan. And that being said, that does cover it for the risk module in the advisor portal. And the next thing that we're going to look at here today is the client-specific risk analysis found within each client plan. So let me go ahead and reopen that plan for Barry and Iris. Then I'm going to navigate back into the investment module here and back into that risk analysis page here. Perfect. So here we are back again in the risk analysis. And this is where we can analyze risk in regards to this specific client household. And in typical RightCapital fashion, we're also going to find a number of interactive, client-friendly visuals in this area as well. So let's go through each of these tabs in order here, starting with our summary tab. We did already look at this chart briefly at the very top of the presentation, but just to review, the risk summary chart here is where we can view the client's assigned household risk score in relation to the risk of their current portfolio, as well as the risk of a chosen target portfolio. You can set the target using this drop down in the upper right of the chart here. And this is tied to the asset allocation tab. For those of you who might be familiar, in the asset allocation tab, you can compare the client's current allocation to a chosen target. And changing the target here is going to change it in the risk module and vice versa. So these two targets are tied together. In addition to the risk summary chart, there are two other charts available within this page. So in addition to the risk summary, we also have the risk comparison, which is going to add three major asset classes for additional context and comparison. In particular, those being money market, corporate bonds, and large growth. So the risk scores for each of these asset classes is based on the standard deviation of each asset class. So it's a simplified version of the calculation that's used for the current portfolio risk score. And the last chart here is going to be the household risk classification chart. And this is going to show us where the client's household risk score falls in relation to those custom risk tolerance categories that we just created back in the advisor portal. So looks like for this particular household, we're right on the cusp of medium and high tolerance here. This is technically a medium tolerance household based on that household risk score of 70 here. One additional note, if you do have the categories turned off in the advisor portal, this household risk classification chart will just be hidden from view. So you'll only see these top two charts here in the summary tab. Perfect. Our next tab here is going to be the analysis tab. And this is going to present us with an interactive visual highlighting the potential range of annual returns for the client's current portfolio, our chosen target portfolio, as well as those same three asset classes that we looked at back in the summary. And the purpose of this page is really to be able to highlight for clients the potential risk reward trade-offs, how much they could potentially gain or lose depending on how risky their investments are. So as you can sort of see here, you can hover your mouse over the chart to zero in on a particular upside or downside percentage. You can also use the legend at the bottom of this chart to sort of bring one of the two to the forefront, or to hide one if you want to just isolate the upside, or maybe just the downside. I believe I mentioned this back when we were looking at the upside and downside for the model portfolios back in the advisor portal, but these percentages are tied to your advisor specific return assumptions. So it is going to use your assumptions in tandem with standard deviation to determine the potential upside and potential downside for each portfolio and asset class. And you may have noticed with the legend here, but this is being based on a 95% confidence interval. So we're removing some extreme outliers, the top 5% on the upside and the bottom 5% on the downside, which for those of you who are familiar is very similar to what we see with the Monte Carlo analysis in RightCapital. Perfect. So that's the analysis tab. Next up here, we have our score and assessments tab. And we did look at this briefly. This is mainly divided into two distinct sections. The first section here being this risk score section is where we can actually set that household risk score for the clients. So something I didn't highlight here before that I want to make sure I mention now is that within this drawer where we set that household risk score, you're also able to see all of the model portfolios that fall within plus or minus 10 points of your selected household score. So if I slide this around, we'll be able to see that that changes as a result of which portfolios are within plus or minus 10 points. And if you have risk tolerance categories turned on, you'll also see a risk classification here, which risk tolerance category your chosen score falls into. So again, if you have risk categories turned off, the risk classification simply won't appear here, but you will still see the portfolios at the bottom of this drawer. Perfect. The second section of the score and assessments tab is the risk assessments area here. And as you might have guessed by now, this is where we can assign these clients risk questionnaires to complete. So as you can see here, I did assign a sample questionnaire that's already been completed. So we can see when the assessment was assigned, when the assessment was completed, and the risk assessment score based on the client's answers as well. So as well as whether or not that's been shared with the client, which is this little icon to the right here. So let's walk through this. Let's assign a new assessment questionnaire here. We can click the Add Assessment button on the right-hand side of this page. That's going to open up this drawer where we can select our questionnaire and then choose which client we want to complete that questionnaire. So we should see our webinar questionnaire that we just published a couple of minutes ago here. So we can select that as our questionnaire. This is a joint plan, so I can choose whether I want to assign this to the client or the co-client. And then from there, you really have two options in terms of how to proceed with this. The first option is going to be this start button in the lower left corner. And that is simply going to start this questionnaire right away. So if you have the client present with you in person, this is a great option. You can simply start the questionnaire, turn the screen towards the client, and have them fill this out right then and there. But if the client is maybe not with you in person, you can always use the save button instead to save and assign that questionnaire to be completed at a later date. So I did that for Iris just now. We can see that that is in progress currently. And one additional thing to note here is that if you've invited this client to have access to their RightCapital plan, this save option is going to allow them to complete that questionnaire on their end within the client portal. So if you are someone who is inviting clients and you want them to complete these questionnaires remotely, you can save and assign that client a questionnaire. And the next time they log into their plan, they'll be notified. They'll see a pop-up screen prompting them to complete that questionnaire. If you'll remember, when we created this questionnaire, there was a space to add an optional introduction for the questionnaire. And that introduction is what the client will see when they log in. It'll be a little message that says, hi client, followed by your introduction, whatever that may be, and then an option to complete that questionnaire right away or to do it later. We do actually have an article in our help center that shows exactly what it looks like from the client side when you assign them a questionnaire. So if that's of interest to you, I'll make sure to highlight where you can find that particular resource closer to the end of the presentation today. Perfect. I do want to reopen one of these questionnaires I just assigned just so we can finish walking through this process. Once the client has dialed in all of their answers here, you'll notice that a complete button will appear at the bottom of the screen here. And clicking that complete button is going to lock in the answers for that questionnaire and then also calculate the risk assessment score based on the client's answers. So I'll click complete. We can see that these answers are locked in place now. We can no longer change these. And if I click OK, we can see that this, based on the answers I just selected, the risk assessment score here is 72 out of 100. Great. So before moving on, I do just want to quickly show how we can share these scores with a client. So, if you are having clients complete these questionnaires remotely via their client portal, they will not see the risk assessment score after finishing the questionnaire by default. So if they complete the questionnaire on their end, like I just did, it will simply vanish, after they hit complete and then exit out of that window. They will not see that they just scored a 72. But if you want to share that score with them, you can navigate into their risk tab on the advisor side, reopen that questionnaire here, and then just toggle on this shared with client button here. And by doing that, you'll notice that this little icon is now open rather than closed, and that indicates that the client will now be able to see this score of 72 on their end as well. Perfect. Before moving on from assessments in general, the last thing that I want to mention here is, just like the risk categories that we looked at, risk assessment questionnaires are by no means mandatory in RightCapital. One of the questions that I've been seeing pop up since release is, do I have to have my clients complete a risk questionnaire to use the rest of the risk tools? And just to answer that question for all of us here today, you absolutely do not have to use questionnaires in order to use the rest of these tools. Our team really designed all of the risk tools to be flexible, to allow you to decide which tools you want to use and which tools best fit your practice and the needs of your clients. So, if you want to assign a client a questionnaire and then dial in the household risk score to reflect their questionnaire score, you can certainly do that. Maybe if you want to assign a questionnaire to both clients and then make the household risk score the average of the two, you can do that as well. And ultimately, if you're someone who maybe prefers to sit and have a conversation with your clients about risk tolerance rather than utilizing a questionnaire, you can simply assign them a household risk score without ever even touching the questionnaires at all. So I just quickly wanted to address that. It is really entirely in your control how you use each of these tools. Perfect. Moving on from score and assessments, the last tab that we have here in the client-specific risk analysis is the details tab. And this page is where you can find the risk scores of the individual assets within that client plan. So we can actually see here, which assets are making up that client's current portfolio risk score. So if I click back into the summary here, this current portfolio risk score, we can see in the details tab what assets are making up that score, along with the respective allocations, standard deviation, and corresponding risk scores for each individual account. So maybe if a client's current portfolio risk score is a little bit higher or lower than you expected it to be, this details tab can really be helpful in identifying what might be causing that. Maybe there's one hyper aggressive account that's skewing the entire portfolio towards a higher risk score, or maybe there's one very conservative account that's doing the opposite. You can quickly and easily identify if something like that is the case within this details page here. Perfect. So while we're here on the details page, the very last thing that I want to show you today within the client-specific risk analysis is the action items. So if I open up the action items here at the bottom of this page, you can actually find the action items at the bottom of any of these tabs. It doesn't change. So if you open up the action items and then click the edit button in the lower right corner, this is going to allow you to add or remove individual accounts from the risk analysis. So by using the action items edit button, you have flexibility and further control to customize what assets are being included in that client's current portfolio risk score. So maybe just as an example, if you want to exclude a particular account from that risk analysis, you can uncheck that box in this drawer here, click save, and that's going to recalculate the current portfolio risk score without that account factored in. And if we click back into the details tab, you will no longer find that account listed here either. So you have full control to include and exclude specific investments in the plan as you see fit within a client's risk analysis. In a similar vein, there are a couple of additional layers of flexibility depending on what you'd like to include and exclude from their risk analysis. So in particular, we're going to touch on two different adjustments that you can make here. One of them is going to be adding bank accounts into the risk analysis, and the other is going to be adding annuities into the risk analysis. So starting with bank accounts, you'll notice that those aren't included by default here. we're just looking at the investment accounts in this plan currently, but we do have the ability to add bank accounts into this analysis if we'd like. Very similar to the asset allocation in RightCapital. And it's actually the exact same setting that you can use to add bank accounts to the current allocation here in the asset allocation tab, as well as to the risk analysis. So I'm going to pivot over to the settings quickly just to show us all where that setting lives. So I'm going to click into the gear icon settings tab. And then within the methodology page here, if I scroll down towards the bottom, it is specifically this setting, include bank accounts in asset allocation chart. So by checking this setting and clicking the save button, now if I click back into the investment section, not only are bank accounts being included in this pie chart here, they're also going to be included in the risk analysis. So we can see I've got a slightly lower current portfolio risk score now. And if I click back into this details page, we can see now there's some bank accounts listed here, some savings and checking accounts. And just like with the investments, if you click the edit button within the action items at this point, you'll find those bank accounts here as well. So you can pick and choose which accounts you'd like to have factored in here, including the bank accounts in the plan as well. Perfect. The last thing I want to show us is how to include annuities. So I do have an annuity on deck here within the profile, so bear with me just a second as I re-include this into the plan. Perfect. So something to note with annuities in particular, by default within the risk analysis, the annuities are not going to be included. So if you do have annuities in the plan, they are going to be available to select here within the action items edit button, but they will be unchecked to start. So just something to be aware of. If you do want to include annuities in the risk score, you can certainly navigate to the action items edit button, check off the annuity from this list here, and then click save. And just like the bank accounts, that's going to recalculate the current portfolio risk score to include that annuity, and we'll be able to find the details for that annuity here as well. So the equity fixed income split, the standard deviation, and the risk score. Perfect. So that does cover it for the client-specific risk analysis tab in RightCapital. There are a couple of additional things to touch on here before we transition into the Q&A for today. I will try to keep it brief because I see that there are quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to do my best to answer as many of those as I can. But there's a couple extra things I'd like to show you here. So with the release of RightRisk, we added a couple of new snapshot widgets to the dashboard area that correspond to risk. So if you're someone who likes to use the snapshot either in your presentations or as that one-page report for clients, you'll now find two additional items that are available to be added here related to that client's risk analysis. So if you click Add Item in the upper right, under Key Metrics, you'll now find a household risk score widget. And that's going to be that household risk score that you manually set within each client plan. So in this case, that's going to be 70. Clicking the Open Item button is going to launch us into that area of the software so we can take a look at the risk analysis directly from the snapshot. And then in addition to that widget, there is an additional widget under Investment. It's going to be the Risk Summary widget. And that's going to show that risk summary chart that we just looked at, within the summary tab of the risk analysis. So two additional snapshot widgets that you can choose to incorporate into your snapshot reports as a result of RightRisk. Perfect. And the very last thing that I'm going to touch on here is just reporting. As with every tab and every new feature we release here at RightCapital, you of course have the ability to include all this information in your PDF reports that you generate for clients. So I'm going to click into the gear icon in the upper right corner and then into the report tab. And you'll now find under the investment section an area to include risk information in your reports. And you may notice that similar to the analysis and the cash flows in the retirement section, this is an underlined area that we can actually click into and have some additional flexibility to customize. So maybe you just want to include the risk summary chart, maybe you want to include all of the summary charts and that analysis tab showing the potential upside and downside of those different portfolios and asset classes. And there is also an optional toggle here to include questionnaires in the reports as well. So, by toggling this button on, you'll be able to choose between all of the completed questionnaires within that client plan. And by checking these off, those questionnaires will be fully included in the report. So it'll show all of the client's answers to each question in addition to their risk assessment score at the end. Perfect. So that does cover it for our introduction to right risk here in Right Capital.